coming out the back of the Olympics and the Paralympic Games, but the Olympics was really where we had a huge scandal and a conversation around genetics, and it not only exploded in the sports space, but probably in a social capacity as well, and got a massive topic going on. Where do we currently stand right now in the landscape of genetics in sport?
So genetics in sport, specifically in terms of sex and gender, I think you're talking about. So rather than genetics sort of within each of those categories, which is a slightly different topic about, what makes someone successful or helps them respond to training better, that kind of thing. So in terms of the sex and gender and how genetics relates to that, there's two categories of athletes, I suppose, and both of them have genetics, I would argue, right at the heart of them. But I would definitely treat the two categories of athletes separately. So one is for transgender athletes. So if you're talking about trans women competing in the female category, that's where, understandably, most of a lot of attention is focused on, because you've got people who, assuming that they've gone through male puberty, then they've, during those sort of early mid-teenage years, they've put on extra muscle mass, they've grown in height, they've grown their limb length and so on, and they've increased hemoglobin level as well for carrying oxygen. So they've got a variety of physical advantages, which most people then in the female category don't have. And the genetics comes in because ultimately it's down to chromosomes, and a typical male has got a Y chromosome, a typical female has not. And that's the basis of the difference. So then if you're talking about eligibility of trans women in the female category, you're bringing in that genetic difference, which traditionally is not in that category. So that's the one. That's a quick summary of the one category, the trans athletes. I can move on to the second category briefly, if you like. Yeah. So the other category, and I really would want to emphasise that this is different. So then these are athletes with differences in sex development. Sometimes not necessarily meaning exactly the same, but words that are used are sex variations or intersex. And these athletes then have some genetic difference from the norm. And usually these are very rare genetic differences. And there's a whole variety of them which kind of fall under the umbrella of a difference in sex development or DSD, but they almost there's a big variety between the different types, and even within one type of them, almost no two individuals have the same genetic mutation or change in them. So it gets really complicated and interesting academically from a genetic side then. So then how their eligibility relates to, their eligibility for the female category in sport, it gets really complicated. Some people think there's a simple solution. I would argue probably not. Maybe we'll get into that. And it revolves around, I suppose, fairness and safety in sport for female competitors as a whole, competing against your approach to how eligible someone should be or inclusion, to put it that way.
Do you mind just explaining what DSD is and why it potentially forms, or is it totally random?
So, like I say, it's an umbrella term, and that covers a whole set of different conditions and in many cases medical conditions, that might need some treatment, but not all perhaps do. So these are inherited genetic things. Well, I'll just rewind slightly on what I said there. Many of them are inherited from mum and dad, as of course textbook genetics will say. That's where you get your DNA from. But in every birth of every human, there is just a few, I'll call them imperfections, but there are a few differences between the DNA of the child and the complement, the DNA of both parents put together, because nature isn't isn't able to absolutely perfectly, faithfully copy every single letter of the 3 billion base pairs of DNA that makes up your genome from one generation to the next. So there are a few changes in every individual which are different from either of the parent. So some individuals with a DSD that genetic change has happened as one of those that is unique to them and isn't in either parent. And in other cases, it is a case of inherited things from one or other, or sometimes both parents.
So you're explaining there two categories, which you're talking about, category of trans athletes, and then the second category being DSD athletes. Am I getting that correct? So with both of those categories, as we now move into sport, and especially the example that came up this year in the Olympics, for those that may not have seen it, there were boxers that were classed as DSD. There was a lot of conversation around whether they were DSD, whether they were trans athletes. There was misinformation constantly being put out there. There was two conflicting organisations with different policies. So from what you've said there, and now I guess as we could maybe say as the dust has settled from the Olympics, what really went on in those examples from what you've just explained? So were we dealing with trans athletes? Were we dealing with DSD? Yeah, what really went on with the boxing scandal going on in the Olympics?
Yeah, so very specifically on that boxing scandal. So I don't think anyone seriously, with any information at all, was claiming that these were trans athletes. So the suggestion was that they are athletes with DSDs. And they might be, but nobody knows. That is not public knowledge. And I certainly don't, excuse me, I certainly don't know that either. Where we got, how it all became the story that it did in the Olympics, I think relates to, I suppose if you go back a few years, then the International Olympic Committee changed what they previously had as guidelines about how to about eligibility of both trans athletes and those with DSDs for the female category. And I think it was 2021 they produced just a framework which had 10 principles as part of it. And many of the principles almost everybody agrees with, and some of them are people don't all agree with, and I would be one of those as well that doesn't agree with all 10 principles, such as that no assumption of presumption of advantage should apply to any group of athletes. So that's one of the principles, is that you should not have a presumption. Many, including me, would argue that a trans woman athlete has it is safe to presume they have an advantage because if they have been through male puberty. So that's an example of treating a group of people as one, as opposed to always looking on an individual basis. So by having this framework in relation to the DSD at the recent Olympics, then what the framework did as well was essentially devolve decisions or regulatory sort of policy completely to the individual sport federations. So, cycling, athletics, boxing, and all the others were left to have their own devices, left to come up with their own regulations regarding both DSD athletes and trans athletes. And the reality is that many of the sport federations just don't have the resources or the time or the expertise or any of those to develop coherent policy that applies to their sport. So many of them just literally have not. They have a blank space where a policy might be. Others have just continued what the old IOC guidance was before 2021. They just haven't updated any documentation since then. And some have tried to write their own regulations, but perhaps not surprisingly, they've come up with maybe different regulations to the next sport, even though at the heart of it, there's some very similar physiological capacity properties that apply to, for example, athletics and rowing and cycling. Ultimately, you're still talking about things like that happen during puberty. You're talking about growth of muscle mass and hemoglobin concentration and so on. So at the recent Olympics, then you had the IOC saying largely all federations do what they want to do, and then the specific case in terms of the Federation for Amateur Boxing was that they had recent other difficult sort of accusations of I believe corruption, a little bit outside my sphere, but and the IOC had essentially removed the authority from them to govern boxing in the Olympics. So the IOC assumed that responsibility, and they only have this framework that devolves regulatory responsibility to the federations. So they just went for a policy that I suppose agrees with their own principles about, which means that there would be no real testing of athletes, and there wouldn't be a presumption about someone's status and those kinds of things. So ultimately they went with what someone had sort of their legal status as on their passport, whereas the IBA that had the power removed from them, they claimed to have done some sort of genetic test regarding chromosomes. But they didn't release the full detail of that, so I don't think anybody quite knows.
That's what I think where we found this kind of, in inverted commas, misinformation being sent around, was the fact that I think all of the assumptions and probably the judgments that were very, very quickly placed on the athletes were through the lens of being trans athletes. From what you're saying, is that's a category where you can start to make presumptions if they've been through the puberty in which the sex that they were born at.
So I think this is fair comment. I and the majority of scientists that have commented in this area would agree with that statement. Yes, with the current state of evidence, then yes, you can make that conclusion that they would be carrying advantages into the female category, which otherwise you wouldn't normally have in the female category, and that obviously is disrupts the fairness in the category, and where there's direct physical contact, and particularly in combat sport, then potentially the safety of other competitors. So yes, regarding trans athletes, I would make the big distinction then about DSD in that even if someone, and some scientists do think that a similar policy should be applied to someone with a DSD, maybe if they also have a Y chromosome, as some athletes do, even they would agree with me that the volume of direct evidence about athletes with DSDs is almost zero, perhaps understandably because there's not very many of them and they haven't been participants in research studies and so on. But the direct evidence is almost zero, and there are a whole load of ethical consequences about having a testing regime which you would need to do to identify those with DSDs. Whereas in contrast with the transgender athletes, then one clear difference from DSD athletes is that a trans athlete knows exactly their own personal history, and there's no medical information that would be revealed to them as a result of some testing program, whereas for athletes with DSDs, that's precisely what would have to happen.
I know this is going to be a very generalized question, but if you can, is there a way in which you can distinguish the sort of the upbringing and, I guess, puberty experience that someone that would be assigned as DSD would have?
Yeah. So there is a big variety because it depends on the type of TSD they have, and even within the type of TSD there is variability. But what one might be talking about is someone who, at the moment of birth, was their sex was recorded as female, but actually unknown to the people involved, and perhaps in some parts of the world where high quality medical care is not as common during pregnancy and with an infant as well, then there would be a greater possibility of this going undiagnosed at the moment of birth. That someone might be recorded as being female, and then at some later point it might be before puberty, but often it can be around puberty. Then an individual will go through some physical development, and sometimes that will be more what you would expect in a typical male in terms of their physique, and that might also include development of external genitalia as well, that sort of that changes their appearance in that respect. And some of those individuals, leaving aside athletes for a moment, some of those individuals then, if they haven't been picked up before that, they will be, then some medical care will be provided, and then there's a decision to be made by the young person, maybe their parents, medical professionals, and so on, about how they live their lives and effectively their gender identity, I suppose you could say. So that kind of describes what can happen, but there is great variability. So some people get to puberty and there is no change in their external genitalia, and if they continue to have no reason to consult medical professionals, then they grow into young women, and again there'll be a variety of different type of DSD that they might have, but some of them probably have some element of physical development that you might find in males normally, and others might have none of that. Others might have just a little bit of that, and so on. So that's where if you were going to try to regulate it, you then need to have a very detailed sort of testing regime, which is extremely problematic, in ethical terms.
There's a huge correlation between the differences that happen in, say, Paralympians, right? Paralympians, that the different conditions that Paralympians have, each condition, that even if two athletes that have cerebral palsy, it will manifest itself slightly differently to the person next to them. Even if you have 10 athletes lined up on 100 meters, it could be a vastly different thing. And I think that's when people get to see it on a physical basis, so they can it's so visualized, like you can see that, okay, I can see the impairments on each athlete. I myself have Poland syndrome, a condition that I was born with, and I'm missing my right pectoral muscle, 2 ribs, like I'm missing muscles. I know the person next to me who would have that condition has a slightly different variation. I've been in rooms with people with this condition. I know the variation that exists. But I think when we're talking about genetics, because it's an unseen thing, up until when you potentially have the physical outcomes of, say, higher testosterone levels that have developed, but yet you're looking at someone who has a much more feminine physique as a generalization, it becomes a huge question. And I think this is where, from my own, and I have no experience as far as this area of expertise at all, but from my overview of it, is that we have conflicted these two categories that you have distinguished the difference in, and we are trying to treat them exactly the same, when actually we need to be very clear with what we're dealing with and what we're talking about, especially when people are starting to throw rocks and starting to really throw judgment before they even know the information. And like you said, it's almost like what I asked you before the episode. Are we making a complicated issue and trying to simplify it, or are we trying to oversimplify, trying to complicate a very simple issue. And I think what you've described there is clearing it up for sure, but also it's, I don't know where you stand it, but it does sound like we need to be much more rigorous in especially DSD.
Yeah, so yes, I think for athletes with DSD, honestly, I don't really know what the solution should be. I think about this a lot, and I just discuss these things with lots of very clever people with different expertise to myself, and yeah, I don't know what a solution should be. In contrast to the transgender athletes, where at the moment I have a position, if different research results came out regarding transgender athletes, for example, the effect of lowering testosterone in a trans woman, and if there was clear evidence that the in quotes male advantage that they had acquired by going through puberty as a male could be removed in some way at a performance level. I mean, they're not going to lose their height or limb length, but if somehow performance was equated, then I think that would change the conversation regarding that type of athlete, and the studies that have been done with trans athletes lowering their testosterone are not great quality as a whole. There are over a dozen studies of different types, and they all have their limitations, but collectively they form some body of work which forms my position anyway. But for athletes with DSDs, it is where the research should be. There's just a blank space, pretty much. There are some little bits of data in the literature about DSD athletes, which I'd be happy to go into just what there is in terms of how poor maybe that is. And then you, so like I said, the evidence base for excluding them from the female category is almost blank, and then to continue to do so with all the implications of the testing procedure and so on, and the finding out information about themselves, and the ongoing medical care that would then be initiated, which might not have happened or might not have happened for several years or something, but all being initiated as a result of a sport federation insisting on a test. You put those two things together, absence of any convincing evidence, the consequences from that, then personally I reach a different conclusion regarding those athletes. I mentioned a couple of the studies that do talk about DSD athletes.
Yeah, sure. Go into what they've. Well, it sounds like as well. Just before we talk about it, I can't remember, and this is a reason why I found your work and I wanted to get you on, was because I can't remember a time when I'd actually heard of DSD before this Olympics. So I don't know if were there DSD athletes where there was conversations that had happened before, but maybe it's because of the global trans athlete conversation it got highlighted in this Olympics. And was there anything before the Paris Olympics?
Yeah. So yes, there was, but I think you're dead right that people's awareness of the whole sort of eligibility with the female category has been heightened a lot by several high-profile transgender athletes. Yes, but yeah, I'm sure you have heard of Caster Semenya, South African 800-meter runner. Who hasn't run competitively for a few years now, so Caster is is an athlete with a DSD. That's public knowledge as a result of the court case that took place in 2019. Which was really at the time it was the culmination of several years of differing regulations by World Athletics, or the IAAF as it was at the time, and probably some pretty poor sort of ethical, poor personal treatment of Caster at the time as well. So at the time it was the culmination of a story, but actually those things have have still continued, including Caster Semenya herself being partly involved in further legal proceedings and so on. So it has been there, but I totally understand. Yeah, that I think everybody's awareness of these things has come up because of the trans athletes. Yeah,
I can't really believe that I didn't actually. I mean, I didn't when Caster Semenya was having that trial. I didn't actually go in to find what they found. To be fair, because I thought, okay, well, hopefully they come to a amicable conclusion here. So I didn't know the actual what was going on. So that's interesting. But at the same time, I'm thinking there wasn't, from what I'd read from the I guess it was the media reports at the time, there was no sort of comparison with Caster Semenya. It wasn't as much. It was very much a judgment based. A lot of the media they put out there they were judging it based on the trans athlete argument. That seemed to be what I was seeing. And I think for a lot of people, if you had actually said, well, this is a very similar case to Caster Semenya, it might have simplified it a little bit more. But it was the fact that I think early on, media jumped on top of it. It was a story, the outrage, and then digging up all of the other examples that had happened in the trans athlete examples and the unfairness that was being spoken about there. And it was just another media storm that could be created when actually the reasoning behind it seemed to just be put in the corner and go, well, we'll deal with that once this storm has finished.
Yeah. So the individual athletes being the centre of these kind of media storms, how on earth can that be? How can that be let happen? Because hopefully all the individual athletes that have been at the centre of these storms, hopefully they come through it well. But you could understand, when some really deeply personal either information about them or just false accusations and things are thrown around, that could be really damaging to an individual psychologically, and that's really a product of the for the DSD athletes of the approach to testing by some sports organisations. Or how testing is initiated, which is only when somebody starts getting really good, and there is some sort of suspicion either from other athletes or coaches or administrators in the sport will point to this a particular athlete and say, this person needs to be investigated, and or it the athlete in question might go through their first anti-doping procedure, and a testosterone level outside of the well above the normal range might be seen, and then that can be the stimulus for further investigation. But again, anti-doping will only normally take place much more often at a higher level of competition. So some people just recently, actually, in an editorial in Scandinavian Journal of Science and Medicine and Sport, have put forward a proposal of much earlier genetic testing. They called it screening. I would argue with that, but this would be based on a swab sample, which would get you the DNA material, and then their proposal was that if someone does not have a Y chromosome, then they would be given the thumbs up. Yep, you carry on. And if they have a Y chromosome, normally found in males, then that would be the stimulus for further investigation. And that further investigation would then be a much more detailed genetic investigation. But importantly, one of the very first steps is also a very detailed, invasive clinical examination. So literally of external and internal genitalia, evaluating someone's secondary sex characteristics like extent of body hair and depth of voice and so on. All these things are sort of included in a rating scale, and then that is part of this holistic clinical assessment. Because what trying to be found out by that is primarily whether that person is responsive to their elevated level of testosterone. Because in some DSDs, those people are not. And the regulations that a sport like athletics has says that if someone is not responsive to that testosterone at all, then they can continue to compete. No problem, because they haven't had that any influence of that higher testosterone level. But some people then do respond to it, but the only way but there is no laboratory sort of test tube test for responsiveness to testosterone. It is only determined by this clinical examination and everything that involves.
But if they, regardless of whether they've responded or not responded, and you find heightened testosterone levels, is the current policy that if they still exceed the levels at which the governing body deems too high, then they're excluded from the sport?
So the different sports have different policies. As I said before, many of them don't even have a policy. But the sport with the most developed policy, I'll put it that way, is athletics. So World Athletics have theirs. They updated their regulations. I think it was 2023 was the latest update. And their policy is that athletes are only excluded from the female category. Athletes with a DSD are only excluded if they have one of a short list of DSDs, which involves them having a Y chromosome, which is the one usually found in males, and they have testosterone so outside of the normal female range, and they are responsive to that testosterone. And that's where the clinical examination comes in. And the reason they have that, of course, because if an athlete and a supporting legal team and some doctors and so on said, well, my client has a DSD, but they are not responsive to the testosterone, and therefore they have no advantage over all your other competitors in the female category, then the sporting body would be found, their regulations would be overturned, and it would be highly embarrassing for them and probably costly as well. So to have regulations that stand up to challenge, it can only be on those individuals who probably do have an advantage, and that's why you have to do the investigation to get to that answer. And even then, some would argue that the answer is not perfect, but it is the best way. If you're going to do it, it is the best way to do it.
Yeah. How does it get defined whether they are responding to testosterone, and is that on a spectrum as well? So, yeah, when someone is classed as responsive to higher levels of testosterone, how does it look? How does it manifest?
Yeah. So to answer that question, there are highly cited medical papers, because these this clinical examination, including a kind of some scoring systems within that, are part of standard medical practice just outside of sport, to try to help categorize someone's DSD and help inform clinical medical judgments about about their ongoing care, which might involve, hormonal treatment. It might involve surgery of some kind. It might involve changing their gender identity, as a result of learning all these things. So these are well documented sort of standard procedures, and they include, as I mentioned before, sort of some of the secondary sex characteristics. Literally, it is in the documentation about depth of voice, extent of body hair, and I'm just choosing my words carefully here, but the most intimate parts of someone's sexual anatomy being assessed for the nature of that, literally the size of elements of it, and that informs the clinician who makes the holistic judgment there, and so that is how testosterone responsiveness is assessed clinically, and no one has an alternative method to that.
Do you think it would develop? Do you think we're at the sort of edge of that, or do you feel you sort of pulled on every lever?
I'm not aware of any research groups sort of being able to conclude that. I suppose the nearest you might get to that, certainly not currently, is if genetic understanding of these conditions advance more and more. So currently, even those who clinically are assessed as having a DSD, only about 50% of them, even after extensive detailed genetic analysis, only about 50% of them to the clinicians say, yes, we have found the genetic cause. So the other 50%, the genome sequence is scanned, all the known relevant possible mutation sites, all the relevant genes, and they're unable to pinpoint what is the cause, but there almost certainly is a genetic cause. There's just our understanding of detailed genetics is not advanced enough yet. So if that does advance and that 50% becomes 60, 70, 80, 90%, then perhaps that would move you towards a non-invasive, a clearer diagnosis, which could include someone, would have a strong correlation at least with someone's responsiveness to testosterone. But I think that's going to be really difficult because of there are so many possible genetic variations that could cause such a thing. The list will almost never be complete. There can always be a new variant at a different site, or a new combination of variants at different points on the same gene, or 3 different genes that collectively produce a phenotype of a particular type of DSD that hasn't been seen before.
So coming back to a couple of those studies you were talking about in DSD, what did they find?
So I would say the 2 most relevant because they are specifically with athletes on DSD, with DSDs, are one of them, and this is probably the stronger of the 2, reports the frequency of athletes with DSDs in successful athletes. So this was effectively conducted by World Athletics. I can't think of the first author or the date at the moment, but certainly one of the authors would have been Stefan Berman, for example, and there would have been several others, I'm sure. And the essence of that is that athletes with particular versions of DSDs are found much more frequently in successful athletes. I think it was either at a World Championships or Olympics, one of those, but within the track and field athletics, they're much more frequent than you would expect from the general population. And I think that's probably the case. And I think it might be a little bit less distinct personally, because the estimate of the frequency in the general population they used was on the low end of those that I've seen. So actually, DSDs are a little bit more common in the wider population than some reports would indicate, particularly because most of the reports to date come from certain sort of Western European countries, that kind of thing, and the incidence of DSD seems to be higher in some other countries. But I think that the thrust of the conclusion of that paper is probably true, that they're, for some individuals, they're getting a physical advantage in sport that helps them succeed. The second paper looked at the effect of testosterone suppression in athletes with DSDs. So it's the only paper that does this, and the reason they have studied that is because, again, it was conducted by World Athletics essentially. That their regulations still, even there, so over time they have slightly I would say, firmed up their regulations regarding athletes with DSDs. But still, currently, if an athlete with the relevant kind of DSD who is responsive to testosterone, as assessed, as we discussed, then lowers their testosterone to, I think it's less than 2.5 nanomoles per liter, so sort of within the typical female range, and maintains it at that level for at least 2 years, then they are currently eligible to compete. That's quite restrictive, but some athletes might choose to do that. I don't think most are not, is my understanding at the moment.
What is the typical level of women's testosterone?
Yeah, so typically, so in that unit, nanomoles per litre, I might be the odd decimal place off here, but a typical female range, I believe, goes from about 0.1 up to about 1.7, whereas a typical male range is, there's clear blue water for most people, from then the top of the female range through to the lower part of the male range, which might be 10 to 30, something like that. So maybe 10 times more found in males post-puberty than in females. So clear difference, but of course those are based on, that's not considering precisely the athletes that we are talking about. So the second paper then it was a single-authored paper in a sort of endocrinology journal, and it wasn't really a traditional scientific paper with an introduction and a method and a results and a discussion. It was more an opinion piece about the area. And again, the author was Stefan Berman, who works for or with the World Athletics. And within that opinion piece, there's a figure, a graph, showing with sort of running performance on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, and so in other words, time after lowering testosterone and keeping it low. And there's a nice straight line that goes down showing that performance is reducing, running performance is reducing in those athletes after they lower their testosterone. The trouble is that, as I say, there is no method section, there is no statistical analysis. So it's 3 athletes. It was it describes. We don't know anything about their training programs, which would seem pretty important. We don't know anything about their side effects or psychological consequences of taking these quite powerful drugs to lower their testosterone. So without it's not written in any format that one can critique as a scientist. So personally, I think it's basically worthless. So those are the only 2 papers that directly use athletes with DSDs as their participants.
The first one is quite interesting because I think it speaks to the fact that some of this will be almost a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you are growing up with DSD and let's say you do have elevated testosterone levels, I actually think it was Andrew Huberman podcast that I'd heard this, where he'd spoken about the fact that young boys, as they start to hit puberty, your elevation in testosterone, there's a feedback mechanism within us where effort feels good, and effort it makes us feel good. And then straight away I go back to like me being a young kid and thinking, well, I just wanted to run at everything, and every workout I did, I'm doing it until I'm just passed out on the floor sort of thing, just because it felt so good. But if you have from external female, if you're presenting as female, where you're DSD and then there's heightened testosterone, it makes sense that the moment where you might start to play sport, or someone thinks that you're maybe slightly more tomboy than the rest of a young cohort, and then you end up socially being thrown into a sport, because that can be a mechanism that could do it. Your environment starts to change. It then means that every time you start to participate in sport, you do well in it, and it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I've had Dr. Adam Kelly on the podcast where we've spoken about relative age effect, which is similar in the sense of the maturation of a youth, where you start to show attributes and then you do well, and then you just get given more training, and you're not necessarily the most talented, but because you're physically stronger and bigger at that time, you just get better. And this seems like there's a correlation between that experience of these individuals that they might get, which makes sense to find more in elite sport in the end.
Yeah, I mean, even in what you're describing, there's still ultimately it would be initiated by some advantage in some way. But I follow you completely that positive feedback that someone's going to get when they're successful at it. I mean, I've tried all sorts of sports in my time, and I tend not to carry on with the ones I wasn't good at, but have done with the ones I wasn't bad at. So yes, if you're going to get that positive feedback, then you're probably going to enjoy it more, train harder, put yourself out there to compete more, and so on. So I think that's true, but I suppose there's still, like, in the absence of a physical advantage of some way at the beginning, that sequence probably wouldn't have happened. Would you agree with that one?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I think you're right. It still just comes back to the fact that this particular category is so different. It's just unique. It is an outlier. It ultimately is. It's just an outlier, and I think we have to understand it as such, treat it as such, but also realize that there are certain parameters that it must be adhered to, and then also that there, as you've very early touched on, that there are some ethical boundaries that need to be adhered to. And one element we haven't spoken about is whether there are, what are the psychological, I guess, behaviours or sort of costs that come at this. Is there been any research on DSD athletes, or is there any insight into DSD athletes from a psychological standpoint?
Not systematic research that I'm aware of. I read reports and tried to think whether it was I think some of it certainly is. Yes, okay. So there was a booklet or pamphlet report produced by the group Human Rights Watch a few years ago. I think the title of it is something like "They're Chasing Us Away from Sport" or something like that. And that, there are definitely some, reports from individual DSD athletes being interviewed in that and talking about, the psychological consequences of that whole process they've been through, from, being a young, quite successful athlete to then first being tested and then what happened from then on. So I think that I said before that I don't have the answer, and I certainly don't. But my main opinion is that all the kind of different aspects, purely the biological, genetic, through to these ethical things, through to the psychological consequences, need to be considered, and that probably needs a lot of people with much better and different expertise than mine is to sit around a nice big table and thrash these things out and try to get a consistent approach within sports to avoid precisely the situation in the recent Olympics, where it was all based on suspicion and trial by media and social media and misinformation and all that kind of thing. If there was a clear policy across most or all sports, but probably most, there might be some exceptions where you where the need for the regulation might be different. But in most sports where physical ability is a major component, pretty much I think you should have the same policy. And if there was a consistent policy, then there wouldn't be that trial by media. And by all means, have a review of that policy every 4 years, Olympic cycle, something like that. And everyone can come around the table again, and they can bring new evidence if there is any, or they can refine their arguments, whatever it is, and then a position, and the next position is agreed for another 4 years, and that it might be the same as the one before, or it might have changed if the evidence has changed. But at least then the athletes, everybody involved in the sport, the media, everybody would know what, where things are for the next period of time.
Going over to the other category, trans athletes, and probably more specifically trans women athletes. Interesting, I've had Chris Mosier on the show. Chris Mosier is one of a very well-known trans man athlete. Have you come across Chris before?
Yes.
Yeah, so Chris is really interesting. Born a woman, transitioned to a man, successful athlete in, I think it was duathlon and race walking. But Chris's journey was to enhance testosterone. So took testosterone treatments to enhance and transition that way. The one I think is where we're hearing a lot of the controversy and the topics online and in the media everywhere is the trans women debate. And so is it now a much more clear-cut landscape? Has opinions started to be squashed by actual research, testing, and real numbers that can be adhered to?
I think there's been a move in that direction over the last few years, is my kind of take on it. I think I mentioned before, there have been over a dozen studies now that have, and they each have limitations to them, but these are studies that have involved lowering testosterone in people and assessing some aspect of their physical performance. All of the studies have limitations in some respect, either in terms of the type of participants they've recruited, typically untrained or low to moderate sort of training status. Some of the measurement methods they've used, using, hand grip strength as a measure of strength, but how not many sports I can think of that's particularly relevant to. A good, valid measurement of leg strength would be much more relevant to many activities than hand grip strength and so on. So there are some estimates of sort of estimated methods of calculating someone's aerobic capacity as opposed to a direct measurement and so on. So there are limitations to all of those studies in some respect, but collectively, then yes, I think they do form a body of evidence that to deny that and say, well, I'm still not sure, and therefore the implication of that would be to have full eligibility for trans women even after they have lower testosterone in the female category. I think that would be incorrect because it seems to ignore that body of evidence I've just described. But the body of evidence could be better. There could be better studies using more highly trained people. They could use better measurements. They could document the extent and the consistency to which testosterone has been lowered. And if all those things were done, they could have a control group. Not all studies have a control group and so on there. And it could obviously be longitudinal rather than cross-sectional. Some of those studies are just cross-sectional. So there is certainly room for better research that would be more informative. And my guess would be that will just confirm what the other studies are showing. But I try to be objective, and if results come out differently, then people will perhaps think differently.
From the actual mechanism of lowering testosterone in trans women athletes, what is the outcomes when that process takes place?
Yeah. Okay. So there are probably four categories of things that you're trying to look at there. Because these are the four categories of things that typically differentiate between men and women. And those that would be skeleton size, so height and limb length, and also things like the width of the shoulder girdle and so on. All those things are greater in men typically. Second one would be the muscle mass. So and that applies across the whole body, but particularly across the upper body. The third one would be the size of the organs that are relevant to sport performance, and so that would be the lungs and particularly the heart. And if you your exercise physiology will say that it's all that really important is the left ventricle and the maximal cardiac output that is possible from that, due to the maximal stroke volume. And then the fourth one is the blood hemoglobin concentration. Obviously, the protein that picks up oxygen from the lungs, takes it to the exercising muscles and releases it. And that is, there's a very clear difference typically between men and women in that. So all those four things are where the key differences relevant to sport occur during puberty as a difference between men and women. So the question then is, well, what happens to those four things when someone lowers their testosterone to a typical female level for a prolonged period of time? So in sequence, then the skeleton effectively doesn't change. I think with longer term studies, there might be some changes to bone mineral density that might occur, and that might be a sort of something relevant to the health of those people. But in terms of sort of in relatively short period of time, in terms of performance, I think there's no change expected there. Muscle mass, the studies do show that there is some reduction in muscle mass on average, but it is only a fairly small proportion of that typical difference between men and women that many other studies describe. So it might be about 20% of the difference in muscle mass that men would typically have over women might be reduced with maybe a year or two of lower testosterone. The organ size, I haven't seen any evidence that those will change, but I could see I could see a potential mechanism where perhaps there is some reduction in heart size, for example, and the size of the left ventricle, the chamber size. So I could see some element of that, but I haven't seen any data directly on that. And the fourth one, then, the hemoglobin. So this, in contrast to the others, really quite quickly, within weeks, within just a few weeks, when someone lowers their testosterone, then that hemoglobin level in a typical male range comes down to a typical female range. So that's obviously important because that's a really key protein for transporting oxygen and therefore endurance type performance. And so there is at least one school of thought where if someone is lowering their hemoglobin level from a typical male level to typical female level, and yet they haven't really changed their body mass very much, that the analogy that's used is like trying to drive around in a big car with a small engine, and actually that they almost might be at a disadvantage in endurance type events compared to someone who hasn't got that difference going on. I'm not totally convinced by that argument, but only data will give the answer, in my opinion.
I think that was the first time I'd heard of an athlete that had testosterone suppression was in a New Zealand weightlifter, and I believe that was where a lot of the trans athlete media storm set off. And when I read more about it, you realise that athlete wasn't winning the competitions, merely was competing. And I think that was down to some of the things that they cited was the fact that they had a larger frame with less muscle mass and therefore was unable to sort of leverage that in some capacity. The thing I'm actually interested in is what happens psychologically when you start to lower those testosterone levels. So is there an indication of what some of the consequences would be from lowering testosterone at a psychological level?
So honestly, I'm not too sure about that, but as I understand it, then most trans women that lower their testosterone are doing so entirely voluntarily. They're not doing it to comply with a sport regulation. They are doing it as, and the phrase that's here is gender-affirming hormone treatment. So this is part of their treatment, which is considering both their physiology and their psychology as well, and those things sort of go hand in hand, as I understand it. So if anything, then in those people, that the hormone treatment is having a positive effect on their general sense of well-being, as I understand it. Whether lowering a testosterone level from a level that has been much higher for several years has a more specific effect on sport performance and attitude to that, I would be going outside of my knowledge for that. You might know more about that than me, but
I haven't seen anything. Or even just from an anecdotal point of view, or been able to have that insight at all, which is interesting to say, because you would, especially if you go to, say, the gender affirming treatment that they're taking, like from a outset they've signed up to it. They know what they're doing. They're moving towards something that they want. So there must be something, just off the top of my head, there must be something positive for them that's happening. But I've heard from the other way around. So if you think of women who want to transition to men, and there's been reports, and I've just heard this again through just reading and just hearing trans men talk about it, that when they increased their testosterone levels, they couldn't quite believe the effect that had. That the increase in just aggression, or just the increase in anxiety and things like that, and couldn't quite believe, and even just libido going through the roof, and just things like that had an impact. But I'd never heard of the other way around. I'd never heard of sort of those, what were the side effects, or what were the psychological side effects of going the other way and lowering that testosterone. I'm sure there'll be something eventually, but I haven't seen it yet.
Yes. And just to bring DSD back into the conversation again. So, I used the phrase a moment ago, gender-affirming hormone treatment, and that's because, as I understand it, most transgender women are, they choose that treatment, and it is beneficial for them psychologically as well as as much as anything else. Most I'm not sure about most people with DSDs, but certainly most athletes with DSDs, when they have taken testosterone suppressing medication, that has not been voluntary. They have not chosen that. They are not affirming their gender as they see it. Quite the opposite, in fact. And actually, that seems to pass some people by. They just think, well, surely these people, they must enjoy this, because actually underneath they are women, and then they should enjoy the result of looking more like women in some way. And I think that's really sort of putting everybody in the same basket there, and assuming that everyone should think about that the same as they might.
This is where I think people misguide the sporting and social landscape that there is so much nuance within sport, and there is so much, just even if we talk in athletics in general, that the genetic mutations that form in everyday humans, the difference in height and size and muscle mass of every human, that you as the average athlete that has to compete, especially at an elite level, you just have to deal with it. Every person that lined up against Usain Bolt in every Olympics had to just accept that he was the size he was, had the capability he had, and that's just a part of it. Otherwise, if we start to treat sport through this moral lens and trying to be morally fair to each person, then we don't actually have sport anymore. We don't have the idea, and ultimately, sport being sport, we have forgotten that it is not a sport industry as such, that sometimes it's an entertainment industry. And at the athletics level, and at every level in American sports, whether it's NFL, NBA, we want to see people run faster, higher, like jump higher and move faster. And we want to see the freaky things that go on. We're just drawn to those things. And we have to accept that within that, there are these genetic mutations that present in different human beings, and some people unlock it, whether it's through their training, through it just being there. It's just something we have to accept. But it's people usually outside of sport that are unwilling to accept that, and then they place their own fairness lens onto it, their moral lens onto it, going, how does that person feel? And really, sport at its very core doesn't care about your feelings. But it doesn't care. It just is very objective sometimes. And I think when we throw a subjective lens onto it, we cause some trouble for it.
Yeah, wise words, I think. Yeah, no, the sport, on one level, sport is definitely a search for genetic outliers. Yeah.
Totally. That's a great point. And I'd be interested to know where you think just finishing off on it, on the trans athletes argument, do you feel we're in a much more stable space with this now from a policy point of view? Do you think there's definitely needs to be a move into, I don't know whether it's a look, are we being fair enough on our policies with trans athletes, or do we need to look at them further?
Yeah, I still think there's work to be done, because still many sports have either even no policy or just some legacy policy regarding trans athletes, and never mind those with DSDs. But there has been a bit more consistency among some of the major sports federations regarding the eligibility of trans women in the female category. And I think that does reflect, so I was describing before how I think I'm reflecting the majority opinion of scientists in this area about my reading of those studies about regarding trans athletes, and including those about lowering testosterone. So I think two steps forward, one step back. But I think the slow aligning of the policies regarding transgender athletes is reflecting that science. But I still don't think it's healthy that there are differences between sports when fundamentally we're still talking about those things I was talking before, mentioned before, those ones I listed, muscle mass and hemoglobin and those kind of things. And so there should be more consistency between sports as well, I think.
So you think that you can find consistency through that, even though there's differences in what the sports and how those four categories that you spoke about, how muscle mass, how skeleton size and hemoglobin, how all of those can impact each sport differently. You still think that there could be a blanket sort of agenda that's set and just say, right, okay, every sport that sits under IOC, an Olympic sport or federation there, these are the rules and that's it?
Pretty much, yes. I mean, there can always be exceptions, and I mean, people talk about sports, I don't know, dressage or archery, and so I think different sports absolutely should be thought about and sort of as an individual sport, as part of the process. But I think a logical conclusion for many sports would be the same. The moment you get a significant role for physical capacity in all its respects, whether it's strength or endurance, and that is the important point, that it's not the differences, in performance between men and women on average don't differ particularly whether you look at sort of short distance, short duration events through to the longer ones. Probably it seems to be most emphasized when you're using upper body musculature in that short-term activity, because you're sort of combining longer levers and greater upper body muscle mass, and you put those things together and you're producing that, sort of basic physics will say, sort of force times velocity and giving you power. So it's that those upper body power movements where the differences are probably heightened. But even, whether it's those or whether it's just different durations using the lower body, then yes, I can't see a good logical reason why you would have different policies for most sports. I think they probably should be the same, but by all means, yeah, consider each one as part of the process. But I think that the reason different sports are maybe ending up with different conclusions is not about the scientific evidence. It's more about the values they want to portray and that kind of thing, and that's a different question.
Yeah, you're talking about a lot of different boards, a lot of different directors with a lot of different opinions and moral landscapes that they sit on. And I actually think just with this subject, people are just really worried about getting cancelled and just their own skin rather than looking at the scientific evidence and using that as their guiding principle and saying, we're talking about something that is based around, sport is ultimately based around these forces, the biology, the ultimately is like, as a cricketer, right? I know that even in my peers, when I was playing, I knew that if I could increase my muscle mass, if I can increase my utilization of all my different features of being a 6'3" guy, then I was going to have more successful outcomes. And it's like a mathematics equation at the end of the day. It's like purely that. And if I hone in the skills and I repeat it over and over again and I improve my psychology on the focus and the concentration, yes, I can deal with the psychological factors, but ultimately, if I can repeat this process, hit an area on the target on the pitch as many times as possible, I am going to increase my success chances. Therefore, it's going to increase my longevity in my career, my opportunities, wins, insert everything that's successful from sport there, right? And it's where we then think, if I was to put like a fairness lens through it, if I was to put a fairness example through that, every time I faced someone who was a little bit stronger against me or a little bit better than me, I'd have to say, no, this is unfair. I can't do this. I shouldn't be doing this. There's too much of an advantage here. We need to separate this, and this person shouldn't be playing. And that's just not how sport works. Sport does not work on that moral landscape. It works in facts and numbers and forces, like we've said there. So I'm interested to go into your other area of research around performance, just in general with genetics. And the biggest question I think I have is how much of sports performance ends up being genetic nature or the nurturing of those genetic traits?
Yeah, so it's always a combination of the two. It's always the two together. It's not one versus the other. So I can put some percentage values on it, but I'll just frame it before I do. So the percentage values come from twin or family studies where, so in the classic twin study, you have your identical twins and non-identical twins, lots of pairs of each, and then you measure your thing in all the people. So if your thing is VO2 max, so maximal aerobic function, you measure that in everybody. So if genetics is strong, really important, then all the identical pairs of twins they will all be very similar to each other, getting sort of values like this. And all the non-identical twins, because they're differing in their DNA in the same way that any typical brother or sister will differ, then their values are on average going to be a bit further apart. So if genetics is strong, you get all the identical twins same as each other, all the non-identical twins further apart. You crunch the numbers and you come up with a value. If it's the other way around, if genetics is no influence at all, then the identical twins will be no more similar to each other on average than the non-identical twins. You have the same average difference between twins if genetics is not important at all. And you can do that with wider families as well, with slightly different numbers. So you do those kind of studies and you come up with the percentage values, but all that is doing is describing the genetic component to inter-individual variability in a population. It is not saying for one individual that if they can, bench press 180 kilograms or whatever it is, that 60% of that comes from their genes and the other 40% comes from training. It doesn't. You can't translate it to an individual's performance. So it's about differences between people, because of course any one individual can then change their capacity based, with training and so on. So with all that said, then on average, it is around 50% of each. But if anything, I would say the evidence says that it's maybe a little bit more than 50% for genetics and a little bit less than 50% for everything else. So everything else is, lifestyle, training, diet, and so on. That value does differ, though, depending precisely what you're looking at. So, height comes in. Some people, so it comes in at around 80%, something like that. So not 100%, So you think, well, you can't train your height, you can't change it. But the height that you end up as an adult can be affected by nutrition, possibly by sort of illnesses and infections during important growth periods and so on. So it's very heavily genetic, about 80%, but there's a bit of environmental factors in there as well. Something like VO2 max comes in at around 50%. So an equal distribution of factors that affect VO2 max between those inherited through DNA and everything people do in their normal lives. And there are some other things like certain studies have looked at things like risk of tendon injury, and they may be coming in at around 40%. So, the risk of getting tendon injuries is partly inherited, partly comes down through the DNA. Obviously, it's in this case, it's a little bit less than 50% in the studies I've seen. But it's still there. And if you think about it, like any other tissue in the body, tendons are made up of intricate composition of different proteins, and what genes literally do is have the information that codes for making those proteins, and proteins that have just a slightly different structure or orientation to them, a few different amino acids inserted in instead of other ones in their affects their structure, which can then affect their function, and in the case of tendon, potentially their ability to withstand high forces that someone in heavy training would do. Or repeated moderate forces that somebody in heavy training would do. So that's probably the basis for that kind of thing as well, where injury risk is partly inherited. So depends on the trait or phenotype you're looking at, but yeah, averaging at around 50%, something like that.
It's interesting because I think I've always had this. My interest around this stems from the idea that are we missing athletes growing up that are genetically predisposed to positive outcomes in performance, whether it's being good sprinters, good rugby players, basketball players, whatever it might be. Are we missing them, or are we finding them just because their genetics is kind of moving them towards those things that, again, similar to what we spoke about earlier, that once you start to show strengths in certain areas, whether it's at school, being thrown a ball and a bat, or just tackling someone, and you have a positive experience for it, they're just finding their way into sport. So, yeah, I don't know where you stand with that. Are we missing athletes at some stage that probably have positive genetic traits to be high performers in sport, or are we actually finding them?
I think it'll depend on the sport. If you take something really basic, doesn't require that much equipment, something that almost everybody does, like sprinting across the playground at school or the field or whatever it is, then those who are fast, at that young age, they know that early. Everyone else around them, the school teacher, the coach, sees that early, and then that can be worked on, as you said a moment ago. So I think I'm sure there are some individuals who are fast but just don't want to do it, or for whatever reason, or aren't able to, or maybe they get an injury then when they do try and do it. But I don't think there's probably not too much that isn't going unseen in terms of some raw talent there. But in other sports, that's not the case. I mean, I don't know. I doubt this is the case, but maybe I was going to be a really good rower at some point. But I only ever did it on a machine in the gym as a bit of a tryout. I actually wasn't bad, but if I'd have yes, but I wasn't exposed to that, and there's far less exposure to certain sports than others. So I think there probably are, I'm sure there are great genetic profiles out there in some individuals that could make them be really great athletes, superb athletes, that just never had the opportunity or the interest or whatever to get into certain sports. So I think if you were a National Olympic Committee and you wanted to increase your medal haul, strategic thinking would be to not necessarily look at the very the most popular sports. If you were being really strategic, you would be sort of doing a talent identification program and thinking quite a lot about the sports that are where fewer people get into, because you're sort of, you probably haven't got quite to the pyramid of genetic suitability that perhaps exists in the world. Maybe the top of that pyramid isn't just never got into that sport, so your task might be slightly easier.
Yeah, I think there was a Seth Steven Davidowitz. He is a researcher, author, and he came out with this incredible stat around NBA players, and that if you are in the population of being 7 foot plus, that you have 11% chance of playing in the NBA. Those are statistics that are unlike anything in any sport. No sport beats that. There's nothing that beats that. Like that statistical chance of just a pure physical attribute of being 7 foot high. You can go to the NBA, one of the most lucrative sports in the world and publicly watched sports in the world. I couldn't think of, there's nothing else. And it does come down to that there are certain sports that have more physical traits that are necessary within the sport. I remember going to watch some British Paralympic swimmers train, and the coach was a former British swimmer himself and had coached the able-bodied British team. And I said, like, what do you look for in a swimmer? Like, what characteristics? And I thought he'd come back with something around being gritty, and you got to put in the work and be willing to do it. And yes, those were some things that he said, but he said, if they're below 6'3", we won't take them. He said, there's no way that I could get you to, as a 6'2", 6'1" swimmer, pump as much trade. You could be the most disciplined athlete. You could do everything right. You could be the fastest turnover of your arms. But if the swimmer next to you is some Russian 6'7" guy with levers longer, he will win. It's physics. He will just win. And I thought it was a very simplistic way of him putting it, but I thought it's just interesting that you can be essentially not only brought in because of your sort of genetic advantage, but you could also be discarded for your genetic advantage. Basketball, there have been players that are under 6 foot that have played and succeeded. They found a way because there is a skill element involved into the sport. So when you introduce skill, it does change it. It's like cricket. It's an advantage to be a tall bowler. You've got longer levers, but it is not a necessity to be successful. There are guys that I've met that are 5'10" and are world class and have been some of the best ever because their skill level is so high. So yeah, there's the inclusion and removal of athletes depending on what they have, but sometimes it's not that simple.
Yeah. So you're really playing the probabilities, even in team sports where and where there's big skill elements perhaps as well, but you're still playing the probability. So it might not be as certain as in the swimming example that you gave, but you're still playing the probabilities, I suppose. So I'm aware that in rugby union, in terms of identifying young athletes with potential to really succeed when they're older, then then many people do look for that skeletal frame and that height and limb length that they're going to have. And even if that young athlete has not really got much muscle mass, the S&C guys, everybody will back themselves. They'll say, well, we'll work on this. Give me the frame, and I can work on it. And you can't put in what in this case the DNA didn't put in the first place. Yeah.
I think the biggest one that I can, or not the biggest one, but a big conversation is around sprinting and how much your genes make up your ability to be a fast sprinter. How much of that is true? So is it a case that your genes, everyone who is on that 100-meter start line in the Olympics, do they have a genetic advantage over everyone else, or is there a hard work element that's gone into it and the effort that's put in?
So it's still both, but yeah, I would lay a lot of money that if we could do whole genome sequencing of everybody in that final, and we were to compare them to the reference human genome, and if this is a big if we had full understanding of what the differences meant and signified, then it would indeed find that all of them were significantly genetically predisposed to success in sprinting compared to the average. Not so. Absolutely, training is I'd be crazy to say that training wasn't important, and it's not that those 8 on the start line of the Olympic 100-meter final have literally the best 8 genetic profiles for sprinting in the world, but they're up there in the top few percent of profiles, and then that's merged with everything that they do. Yeah, and that's partly because, like I was saying before, that's because so many people have tried sprinting that you really are at the top of that pyramid there, and genetics is part of it.
Where do you think we're heading with genetics in sport and technology? Is there going to be advances that you're seeing on the horizon that's going to kind of change the game?
I think it'll be incremental. I think the sort of 3 categories people talk about where genetics can play a role are talent ID. I think that's probably the hardest one to really bring it in. There's sort of personalization and individualization of training, sort of getting someone's training program to sort of work within or work with their profile, maybe develop those areas that they have more potential to respond to, as opposed to sort of flogging a dead horse on some other aspect.
Also makes sense for injuries as well there.
Yeah.
That would make sense for injury prevention.
Exactly, and that was my third category. Yeah, it was then within injury, identifying people at higher risk of certain injuries, and then again personalising the training. So not just in terms of a performance improvement sort of angle, but yeah, purely to try to minimise their chance, because what people at the coalface, S&C and other people tell me is that we don't have time to do injury preventative sort of training in every athlete for every type of injury they're going to have. But if they can have some indication that these 5 players in a team over here are maybe a little bit at high risk of this type of injury, and these other players are at high risk of a slightly different type of injury, then they can personalize it to that extent. It'll never be perfect, but again, it's about playing probabilities and getting the, from the expensive football team's point of view, getting the most bang for your buck, I suppose.
Yeah, you mentioned Achilles being one of the things that might have that has a genetic predisposition, but is there other injuries that have been found, or is it just tendons at the moment?
No, not just tendons. So also risk of ligament injury as well. So again, sort of connective tissue, and it's difficult, of course, because you in many sports, then you've got some sort of element of contact or other variables which are pretty much regardless of genetics or anything else. But for those, at least for non-contact injuries, and there's an argument for some element of contact as well, but at least for the non-contact injuries, then it's those ones perhaps that the different in genetic risk might be more applicable to.
Do we have an understanding around psychological traits in athletes and their gene structure?
In terms of which genes are important, is that what you mean, Lewis?
Oh, what I mean is there for example, does an athlete that has a higher trait anxiety level, is that genetically determined, or has that been environmentally created?
I probably should have preempted questions like this with your background, and I didn't do. I'll back out of it, but say this, that whenever any human trait that is sport related, or indeed other things like risk of illness and so on, is examined in these studies, these twin and family studies, I have never seen a result come out that's saying genetic component 0 and environmental component 100%. There is always the interplay between the two. So I would be very, very surprised if the kind of traits that you're talking about there, or asking about, were like that. I would fully expect there to be a genetic component. I'm not sure how big that would be. But if you think about it, the kind of traits you're talking about, these are emergent properties out of the human brain and consciousness and so on. And ultimately there are, the material is made out of proteins, which is coded for by the genes, and the plasticity of those structures is probably related to, is not going to be identical between all different people. Some are going to have, more plasticity in that sense than others. And that probably has a genetic component to it. So,
well backed out of. You did that. If you're backing out of that, you backed out of it well.
Yeah, I mean, so different trait, but in terms of skill acquisition and things like proprioception, where these twin and family studies have been done, they come in at quite high heritability estimates of around 70%, somewhere around there. So, and that can be. That can be counterintuitive. Some people say, okay, well, I can see why your height is going to be dependent on genetics, like 80%. But how come the ability to acquire a new skill has such a strong component? But that is what the evidence says. So that again is going to be to do with that plasticity that I was mentioning. About how people, the process that goes on as someone picks up a skill.
Off the top of my head, that would make sense, because the actual acquisition of a skill is a motor skill. It's the repetitive nature of that. And if you have some genetic form of a frame that is set up to move, and whether it's whatever skill it is, again, it could be basketball, but if you are taller, then it's going to be easier to maybe acquire that. Having said that, there's obviously indications. I know guys that I've played with that are in 6'9", 6'10" category, and when you saw them younger, they're just like Bambi on ice. These guys are so uncoordinated. It took proper maturation for them to really move into their frames and go, okay, now I got this. I know how to. I'm driving the car here. I know what I'm doing. So my only interest was around to figure out whether that evolution in sport could be that. And I think probably the one that screams the most, especially in the psychological space in sport, is anxiety. So the predisposition to anxiety. But I sit on my own personal fence here, or I kind of do know where I stand, in the sense that if we are to get so dialed into caring for all of these individual things, especially on a psychological element, I think physical's different. I think if you know someone is 40% more likely to have a Achilles injury, then treating their training with that in mind is a very beneficial thing to mitigate risks down the line. But if we were to say in this different universe that we were saying, okay, we know someone is predisposed to high levels of anxiety, therefore our training will be more psychologically safe, will create safer environments to mitigate that anxiety. I actually think that's a bad thing, because sport isn't safe. Sport doesn't care about your feelings, as I said, and there's probably a huge cost to that through building resilience, building confidence in areas, building self-belief, right, and actually enhancing some of the skills that you're doing. So it may be as such that you would get to a stage where you could say, okay, we know someone's predisposed to anxiety, but we're going to make sure the way in which we care about these challenging environments, or the way we debrief these challenging environments, is really important, but we're not going to change the fact, we're not going to hide them from it. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, I think that would be down to the practical experience and judgment of experts in that area as to how to interpret that and how to action anything, if at all. So yeah, what you say makes sense to me as very much a physiologist and not a psychologist.
Alun, look, it's been amazing to have you on the show and have you here. Is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think we should in this area?
No, well, okay. As you ask, I guess. So I've been talking quite confidently about the influence of genetics and giving these percentage values, just to make it clear that that's the relatively easy task for researchers in the area, is to come out with, it's not very easy, but it's relatively easy to give the percentage. The difficult task is then to identify which genes and genetic variants accumulate to make that percentage, and that is largely a blank bit of paper with a few markers on it for some genes that have been identified. So it was that point in itself, and if you go forward from that to some genetic testing, commercially available genetic testing, anyone who does any of that, pays for some genetic description of their suitability for different types of sport, or what training they should do, or what their diet should be, should keep that in mind. And because most of those companies don't really remind you of that fact, that what they are testing for is just a small proportion of the genes that will influence the traits that they're giving you feedback on, but they've only tested a fraction of the genes, because nobody knows which the other ones are.
Where are you pointing your efforts at the moment? What's sort of in your sights for research?
So personally, we are doing some work regarding where we spent most of what we talked about today. So we're doing some work with around the whole DSD issue and also transgender athletes. We have an ongoing study with that, and then alongside that, we have the work that we do with elite athletes in terms of their genetic profile. So that's a kind of ongoing piece of work. It's a long-term piece of work, and it'll carry on for many years yet. But yeah, so those blank sheets of paper I was describing as to which genes are important, we're trying to fill those in slowly. But yeah, it's a real task.
Alun, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for giving it up and for coming on here to talk about the subject. I have no doubt this is a subject that is complicated to talk about for many different reasons, and so I appreciate you coming on to talk about it, to really dive into this subject, understand it more, and what you're doing with the research. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks very much, Lewis. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
If you've enjoyed that episode with Alun, then you might enjoy other episodes of the show, and we've put together a playlist of some of the best episodes that we could find for you to get started with right away. All you got to do is click right here. Go on. Go.